The cathedral bells tolled with deafening finality as Georgiana Hartwell stood at the altar in her ivory silk gown, her heart racing beneath layers of Belgian lace. The man she was meant to marry, Percival Ashford, heir to the vast Ashford shipping fortune, turned from her mid-ceremony and extended his hand not to his bride, but to her own sister standing among the bridesmaids. "Forgive me," Percival announced to the horrified congregation, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber, "but I cannot marry without love. Charlotte is the one I truly desire." The collective gasp that followed was nothing compared to the sight that came next. A towering figure rose from the shadows of the back pew, his dark eyes fixed on the abandoned bride, and the Duke of Thornfield began walking deliberately down the aisle toward the altar. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning of Georgiana Hartwell's wedding day began with pale English sunlight filtering through the mullioned windows of Hartwell Manor, the family's Georgian estate in the rolling countryside of Somerset. The house, with its honey-coloured stone and perfectly manicured gardens, had been in the Hartwell family for 4 generations, though its maintenance had become increasingly difficult in recent years. Georgiana's father, Sir Edward Hartwell, had invested heavily in ventures that promised returns, but delivered only debt, and the family's standing in society depended almost entirely on appearances and strategic marriages. Georgiana stood before the tall mirror in her dressing room, her lady's maid, Mrs. Davies, carefully arranging the elaborate coils of her chestnut hair. At 22, Georgiana possessed the kind of beauty that artists attempted to capture on canvas. Delicate features, intelligent grey eyes that seemed to hold entire libraries of thought, and a graceful bearing that came not from hours of deportment lessons, but from an innate dignity. Yet as she looked at her reflection, she saw not herself, but the culmination of years of careful planning by her parents. "You look like an angel descended from heaven, Miss Georgiana," Mrs. Davies murmured, pinning another orange blossom into the elaborate arrangement. "Mr. Ashford is the most fortunate of gentlemen." Georgiana offered a small smile, but said nothing. Percival Ashford was not a man she had chosen, but one who had been chosen for her. The Ashfords were one of England's wealthiest families, their fortune built on shipping and trade that spanned from Liverpool to the farthest reaches of the British Empire. Percival himself was considered quite the catch. Tall, fair-haired, with classical features and an education from Cambridge, he was polite in company, generous with compliments, and had courted Georgiana with the precision of a man fulfilling a social contract. Yet in the 6 months of their engagement, Georgiana had never felt the flutter of genuine connection she had read about in novels, never experienced the meeting of minds she had hoped for in a partner. Their conversations remained superficial, touching on weather, social events, and the requirements of their future household. When she had attempted to discuss the political reforms sweeping through Parliament or the scientific discoveries she read about in her father's newspapers, Percival's eyes had glazed with polite disinterest before he redirected the conversation to more appropriate topics. "The carriages will be ready within the hour," her mother, Lady Margaret Hartwell, announced as she swept into the room, resplendent in deep purple silk. Her mother had been beautiful once, but years of managing a declining estate and an increasingly distant husband had etched fine lines around her mouth and eyes. "Georgiana, you must remember to keep your voice gentle during the ceremony." Percival's mother mentioned that he prefers a soft-spoken wife. "Of course, Mama," Georgiana replied, the familiar weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like the heavy wedding veil that would soon cover her face. Lady Margaret circled her daughter, examining every detail with the critical eye of a general inspecting troops before battle. "This marriage will secure everything, my dear. The Ashfords' connections, their wealth, it will restore what your father's misfortunes have diminished. You will want for nothing, and your children will have every advantage society can offer." Children. The thought sent a strange chill through Georgiana. She would be expected to produce heirs for the Ashford line, to manage a grand household, to host parties, and attend functions at her husband's side, all while maintaining the perfect image of the devoted, decorative wife. The future stretched before her like a beautifully appointed prison, each luxury a bar in her golden cage. A light knock at the door preceded the entrance of her younger sister, Charlotte. At 19, Charlotte was considered the beauty of the family, golden-haired, blue-eyed, with the kind of vivacious charm that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Where Georgiana was thoughtful and reserved, Charlotte was effervescent and bold, her laughter ringing through rooms and turning heads at every social gathering. "Oh, Georgiana, you look absolutely magnificent," Charlotte gushed, though something in her eyes didn't quite match the enthusiasm in her voice. "Percival will be quite overcome when he sees you." "Thank you, Charlotte," Georgiana said, noting how her sister's gaze didn't quite meet hers, how her fingers worried at the pale pink ribbons of her bridesmaid dress. "Charlotte, you should be at the church already with the other bridesmaids," Lady Margaret said sharply. "The ceremony begins in less than 2 hours. I only wanted to see Georgie before everything changes," Charlotte said softly, and for a moment Georgiana saw something like regret flicker across her sister's face. But the moment passed, and Charlotte was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of rosewater and an inexplicable sense of unease. The journey to St. Augustine's Cathedral was a blur of familiar countryside lanes, the coach wheels rumbling over ancient roads, while Georgiana sat beside her father in silence. Sir Edward looked older than his 50 years, his face drawn and anxious. He had gambled everything on this match, and they both knew it. "You are doing the right thing, daughter," he said gruffly, reaching over to pat her gloved hand with awkward affection. "The Ashfords will provide well for you, better than I have been able to do of late." Georgiana turned to look out the window rather than respond, watching the green fields give way to the town of Bath, where the cathedral's Gothic spires pierced the grey English sky. The streets were lined with curious onlookers, for a Hartwell Ashford wedding was the social event of the season. Banners in cream and gold, the Ashford colours, hung from shop fronts, and she could see the cathedral steps crowded with guests in their finest attire. Inside the cathedral's antechamber, Georgiana's bridesmaids fluttered around her like butterflies, adjusting her veil and train, offering words of encouragement that barely penetrated the strange numbness that had settled over her. She could hear the organ playing, the murmur of hundreds of guests taking their seats in the pews, the rustle of expensive fabric, and the clink of jewelry. Then came the moment. The music swelled into the wedding march, and the great doors opened before her. The cathedral stretched out like a cavern of light and stone, every pew filled with the cream of English society. Candlelight flickered from 100 sconces, illuminating faces she had known all her life, and many she had never seen. At the far end of that impossibly long aisle, Percival Ashford stood at the altar in his formal morning dress, his expression unreadable from this distance. Georgiana took her father's arm and began the slow, measured walk toward her future. Each step felt weighted, dreamlike, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. She was dimly aware of the admiring whispers, the way guests leaned forward to catch a glimpse of her gown, the approving nods from elder matrons who had prophesied this match since she was in the schoolroom. But as she drew closer to the altar, something began to feel wrong. Percival's face came into focus, and instead of the proud, satisfied expression she had expected, she saw tension in his jaw, a wildness in his eyes that spoke of barely controlled panic. His gaze wasn't on her at all. It kept sliding past her to someone in the row of bridesmaids standing to the left of the altar, to Charlotte. Georgiana felt the first tremor of real fear as she reached the altar steps, and her father placed her hand in Percival's. His palm was damp with sweat, and his fingers trembled as they closed around hers. The Archbishop of Bath, resplendent in his ceremonial robes, began the ancient words of the marriage ceremony, his voice resonant in the vast space. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Georgiana as she stood beside Percival, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes upon them, of the weight of expectation, of the irreversibility of the vows she was about to take. She glanced at Percival's profile and saw a muscle jumping in his cheek, saw the way his eyes kept darting toward Charlotte, and a cold certainty began to crystallize in her chest. If any person can show just cause why these two may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional pause hung in the air, heavy with centuries of ritual. No one ever spoke during this moment. It was merely ceremonial, a formality before the binding vows. But the silence stretched, and Georgiana felt Percival's hand spasm in hers. Then he pulled away. "I cannot." The words were barely a whisper, but in the expectant silence of the cathedral, they rang like a gunshot. Time seemed to fracture in that moment, splintering into 1,000 sharp pieces that would never fit back together quite the same way. Georgiana stood frozen at the altar, her mind struggling to process what her ears had just heard. Around her, the congregation stirred like a disturbed beehive, confused murmurs rising into the vaulted ceiling. "I beg your pardon," the Archbishop said, his elderly face creasing with bewilderment. Percival Ashford stepped back from Georgiana, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and defiant determination. "I cannot marry her," he said, louder now, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "Forgive me, Miss Hartwell, but I cannot marry you without love." The cathedral erupted into chaos. Gasps of shock, cries of dismay, and the rustle of hundreds of people rising from their seats created a cacophony that seemed to press against Georgiana from all sides. She stood perfectly still, her ivory gown suddenly feeling like a costume, her carefully arranged hair and flowers a mockery of the bride she was supposed to be. "Percival, what is the meaning of this?" Lord Ashford's voice boomed from the front pew, his face scarlet with rage. "Explain yourself this instant." But Percival wasn't looking at his father. He had turned fully now, his gaze fixed on the line of bridesmaids, specifically on Charlotte, whose face had gone white as marble. "I have tried to honor my family's wishes," Percival said, his voice shaking. "I have tried to do what was expected of me. But I cannot stand before God and pledge my life to one woman when my heart belongs entirely to another." "No." Georgiana heard her mother moan from somewhere behind her. "No, no, no." Percival moved then, stepping past Georgiana as if she were merely an obstacle in his path, and extended his hand toward Charlotte. "Miss Charlotte Hartwell, you are the one I truly desire. You are the one with whom I have laughed, with whom I have shared my deepest thoughts, the one who makes my heart race when she enters a room. These past months, while I was bound by duty to your sister, every moment we spent together at family dinners, at social functions, only confirmed what I already knew, that you are my true match." Charlotte stood among the other bridesmaids, her blue eyes wide with shock, but Georgiana could see something else there too, a flicker of triumph, perhaps, or vindication. "Percival, this is madness," Charlotte whispered. But she didn't pull away when he took her hand. "Is it madness to refuse to live a lie?" Percival demanded, turning to address the scandalized congregation. "Is it madness to choose genuine affection over cold duty? Miss Georgiana is a fine woman, accomplished and handsome, but we do not suit. She knows it as well as I do. Our conversations are stilted, our interests diverge, and there is no spark of true companionship between us. But Charlotte, Miss Charlotte and I, share a connection that cannot be denied or ignored." "You shared it while courting her sister?" A voice rang out from the crowd, dripping with disdain. "While planning to marry her?" Georgiana felt as if she were underwater, all sounds muffled and strange. She watched her sister, her own sister, stepped forward from the line of bridesmaids, her hand still in Percival's, and the full scope of the betrayal crashed over her like a wave. How long had this been going on? All those family dinners where she had been too absorbed in her books or her thoughts to notice the glances between them. All those social events where she had been grateful that Charlotte could entertain Percival with her vivacity while Georgiana struggled to maintain shallow conversation. "Georgiana," Charlotte said, finally looking at her with something like genuine remorse, "please understand. We never meant for this to happen. We fought against it, truly we did, but love cannot be controlled or denied." "Love!" The word came out of Georgiana's mouth as barely more than a whisper, but it carried an edge that made Charlotte flinch. "You speak to me of love while standing at the altar where I was to be married, while wearing the bridesmaid dress I chose for you, while destroying not only my future but our family's reputation in front of the entirety of English society." "You don't love him either," Charlotte shot back, her voice rising defensively. "You never did. You were marrying him for duty, for money, for the family. At least Percival and I have genuine feeling between us. That is quite enough." Sir Edward Hartwell had made his way to the altar, his face mottled with fury and humiliation. "Charlotte, you will leave this church immediately. And you, Ashford, you have disgraced both our families with this spectacle. The betrothal contract is void," Lord Ashford interrupted coldly, his eyes like chips of ice. "My son has made his choice, reprehensible though the manner of it may be. The Ashford family will not be bound to one whose sister has conducted herself with such impropriety." He turned his cold gaze on Charlotte. "If my son insists on pursuing this infatuation, he will do so without my blessing or support." "Father, please," Percival began, but Lord Ashford had already turned away, signalling to his wife and his younger children to follow him out of the cathedral. The congregation was in full uproar now. Guests were standing, shouting questions, pressing forward to get a better view of the disaster unfolding at the altar. Georgiana could see women shaking their heads, could hear the cutting whispers already beginning to shape the narrative that would follow her for the rest of her life. She was the jilted bride, the woman so undesirable that her own groom had chosen her sister instead. Never mind that Percival and Charlotte were the ones who had betrayed trust and propriety. Society would remember her as the failed bride, the woman abandoned at the altar. "Georgiana, darling, we must leave," her mother said urgently, taking her arm. Lady Margaret's face was streaked with tears, her careful composure shattered. "Come! Before—" But Georgiana couldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, staring at her sister and the man who had been her fiancé, watching them hold hands as if she were merely an inconvenient obstacle they had successfully overcome. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. The months of preparation, the carefully made plans, the future she had resigned herself to, all of it crumbling into dust and humiliation. "I trusted you," Georgiana said, looking at Charlotte with such profound hurt that her sister actually stepped back. "You were my sister, my confidant. I shared everything with you." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, but there was a defiant lift to her chin. "I'm sorry it happened this way, but I'm not sorry for loving him." The organ had fallen silent. The Archbishop had retreated, looking thoroughly scandalized and uncertain how to proceed. Guests were filing out of the pews now, some throwing pitying looks at Georgiana, others deliberately avoiding her gaze as if catastrophic social failure might be contagious. She could hear the whispers growing louder, could imagine the scandal sheets that would be printed by evening, the gossip that would spread through every drawing room in England. "Miss Hartwell," a deep voice said from somewhere behind her, cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. Georgiana turned. Tears she hadn't realized were falling now, streaking down her cheeks, and found herself looking up at a man she had never seen before. He was tall, extraordinarily tall, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence that seemed to create a bubble of calm in the midst of the chaos. His hair was dark, nearly black, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds over the ocean. He wore formal morning dress that had been tailored to perfection, and everything about him spoke of wealth, power, and absolute self-assurance. "I am Edmund Thornfield, Duke of Thornfield," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "And I believe I can offer you a solution to this predicament, if you will permit me." Georgiana stared at him, uncomprehending. The Duke of Thornfield? She had heard the name, of course. Everyone had. The Thornfield dukedom was one of the oldest and most prestigious in England, its holdings spanning 3 counties. But she had never met any of the family, had never moved in such elevated circles. "A solution?" she repeated, her voice hoarse with unshed tears. "Yes," Edmund said, and then, before she could process what was happening, he was moving past her to address what remained of the congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice ringing with the natural command of one born to authority, "I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding today." The murmuring crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to this unexpected new player in the drama. "A misunderstanding?" someone called out. "We all saw what happened." "Indeed," Edmund agreed, moving to stand beside Georgiana with such ease that it almost seemed planned. "We saw Mr. Ashford reveal himself to be a man of no honor or integrity. We saw him disgrace both himself and Miss Charlotte Hartwell with behavior that violates every precept of decent society. But what you witnessed at the altar was not the abandonment of Miss Georgiana Hartwell. It was, in fact, a rather clumsy attempt by Mr. Ashford to interfere with an arrangement that had already been made." Georgiana's head snapped toward him. What was he doing? "I beg your pardon," Sir Edward said, looking as confused as everyone else. Edmund reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he held up for all to see. "This is a betrothal contract, signed 3 days ago between myself and Miss Georgiana Hartwell. Mr. Ashford's claims at this altar were invalid from the moment this document was executed." The lie was so enormous, so utterly brazen, that for a moment no one seemed to know how to respond. Georgiana opened her mouth to contradict him, but Edmund caught her eye, and something in his steady gaze made her pause. He was offering her a way out, a way to salvage some dignity from this catastrophe. But at what cost? The remainder of that day dissolved into a blur of frantic activity and barely contained pandemonium. After the Duke of Thornfield's shocking announcement, the cathedral had emptied with remarkable speed, guests departing in a flurry of whispers and speculative glances. Georgiana had been swept away by her mother and a retinue of servants, bundled into a carriage before she could fully process what had transpired. The supposed betrothal contract, which Edmund had displayed but carefully not allowed anyone to examine closely, had thrown the entire scandal into confusion. Society didn't know whether to pity Georgiana or congratulate her on securing an even more prestigious match. Now, 3 days later, Georgiana sat in the drawing-room of a townhouse in Bath's Royal Crescent, watching rain streak down the tall windows and trying to make sense of the ruins of her life. The house belonged to her father's sister, Lady Agatha Pemberton, a widow of independent means and even more independent mind. Aunt Agatha had descended upon Hartwell Manor the day after the disastrous wedding, taken one look at the chaos, and announced that Georgiana would be coming to stay with her in Bath immediately. "Sitting about moping at the manor will do nothing but provide fuel for gossip," Agatha had declared, brooking no argument. "In Bath we can manage the situation properly." Lady Agatha Pemberton was everything Lady Margaret Hartwell was not. Forthright, unconventional, and utterly unimpressed by social conventions she deemed nonsensical. At 60, she dressed in bold colors that younger women wouldn't dare attempt, spoke her mind with alarming directness, and had scandalized her family decades ago by refusing several offers of remarriage after her husband's death, preferring instead to travel the continent and pursue her interests in art and literature. "You're doing it again," Agatha said now, looking up from the letter she was writing at the elegant writing desk. That staring into the middle distance with a tragic expression. Very affecting, I'm sure, but ultimately unproductive. Georgiana blinked and turned to her aunt. "I was merely thinking." about how your life is ruined and you'll never show your face in society again? Agatha set down her pen with a decisive click. Because if so, you're wasting your considerable intellect on melodrama. Aunt Agatha, I was abandoned at the altar by a man who chose my sister over me in front of 500 people, Georgiana said, her voice tight. I think some melodrama is warranted. You were liberated from a tedious marriage to a weak-willed fool, Agatha corrected, and your sister revealed her true character before you wasted any affection on her. I call that remarkably fortunate timing. Georgiana couldn't help the small, bitter laugh that escaped. Fortunate. Yes, I feel enormously fortunate. Agatha rose from her desk and crossed to sit beside her niece on the velvet settee. Georgiana, my dear, I know this is painful. I know it feels like the end of everything. But consider, you are intelligent, well-educated, and still quite young. You have been granted an unexpected gift, the chance to choose your own path rather than following the one laid out for you since birth. Choose my path? Georgiana turned to her aunt with incredulous eyes. I have no path. My reputation is in tatters. My family's finances are worse than ever. The money father counted on from the Ashford connection is gone. And I am now allegedly engaged to a duke I have never even properly met, based on a forged document he produced to spare me some humiliation. When the truth emerges, the scandal will be even worse than before. Ah, yes, the Duke of Thornfield, Agatha said, a curious smile playing at her lips. I received a letter from him this morning, actually. He requests permission to call upon you this afternoon. Georgiana's stomach lurched. He's in Bath? Apparently he has business in the city and wishes to discuss the situation you both find yourselves in. Agatha watched her niece's face carefully. Do you wish to receive him? Did she? Georgiana had spent the past 3 days trying to avoid thinking about Edmund Thornfield and his inexplicable intervention. She had no idea why a duke of his standing would have involved himself in her personal disaster, what he hoped to gain from the association, or what he might expect from her in return. The uncertainty was maddening. I suppose I must, Georgiana said finally, if only to understand what game he's playing. Good, Agatha said approvingly, because I've already accepted on your behalf. He'll be here at 3 o'clock. Aunt Agatha! You need to start making decisions and moving forward, my dear, not wallowing in what-ifs and might-have-beens. Agatha patted her hand. Now let's get you into something presentable. The lavender day dress, I think. Pretty, but not desperate. Edmund Thornfield arrived at precisely 3 o'clock. His punctuality matching the precision Georgiana had already come to associate with him. Agatha's butler showed him into the drawing-room, and Georgiana rose from her seat, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. In the more intimate space of the townhouse drawing-room, Edmund seemed even taller and more imposing than he had in the cathedral. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal coat and dove-grey waistcoat, his dark hair carefully styled, his expression unreadable. But it was his eyes that caught Georgiana's attention. Intelligent, assessing, but not unkind. Miss Hartwell, he said, bowing with perfect formality. Lady Pemberton, thank you for receiving me. Your Grace, Georgiana replied, managing a curtsy that didn't betray her nerves. Please sit, Agatha gestured to the chairs arranged near the fireplace. I'll ring for tea, though something tells me this conversation might benefit from something stronger. Aunt Agatha, Georgiana protested weakly, but her aunt was already pulling the bell cord, a mischievous smile on her face. Once they were settled with tea, and true to her word, Agatha had instructed the butler to bring brandy as well, Edmund set down his cup and looked directly at Georgiana. I imagine you have questions about my actions at the cathedral, he said without preamble. One or two, Georgiana replied dryly. Such as, why? Why did I intervene? Edmund considered this. Several reasons. First, because the scene unfolding was an abomination of basic decency, and I found myself unable to simply sit by and watch. Second, because I have some experience with society's appetite for scandal, and I knew the narrative would destroy you regardless of whether you deserved it. And third, He paused, something flickering in his eyes. Because I saw in you a composure and dignity under impossible circumstances that impressed me greatly. Georgiana felt heat rise in her cheeks. You don't know me, Your Grace. For all you know, I could be every bit as responsible for what happened as Percival and Charlotte. Are you? Edmund asked simply. No, Georgiana admitted. I had no idea they were forming an attachment. I was apparently too occupied with my books and my own thoughts to notice my sister falling in love with my fiancé. Then you are blameless, and I was right to intervene. Edmund leaned back in his chair, projecting an ease that Georgiana envied. Now, as to the current situation, I took the liberty of making it known that we had a prior agreement, which was, as you noted, entirely fabricated. This places us both in something of a delicate position. Delicate? Georgiana repeated. That's one word for it. When the truth emerges, it need not emerge, Edmund interrupted gently. Not if we choose to make the fabrication a reality. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Georgiana stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. I beg your pardon. I am proposing, Miss Hartwell, that we enter into a genuine betrothal. Edmund's expression remained calm, even as he made this extraordinary suggestion. A proper engagement, conducted with all appropriate formality, followed by marriage at such time as seems suitable to both parties. You're mad, Georgiana said flatly. Why on earth would you tie yourself to someone in my position? A woman associated with scandal, whose family is on the brink of financial ruin, who brings nothing to such a match but damaged goods, and a notorious sister. I need a wife, Edmund said simply. The Thornfield estates are vast, and require a duchess who can manage the considerable responsibilities that come with the position. I am 32 years old, and have put off the matter of marriage for far too long, according to every member of my family. You, Miss Hartwell, need an escape from an untenable situation and a chance to rebuild your life with dignity. We could provide each other with practical solutions to our respective problems. A marriage of convenience, Georgiana said slowly. A marriage of mutual benefit, Edmund corrected. I don't expect love, Miss Hartwell. I don't require romantic sentiment. What I require is a partner of intelligence and capability who can help me manage my responsibilities and eventually provide heirs to the dukedom. In exchange, I can offer you security, position, and the freedom to pursue your own interests within the bounds of propriety. Agatha, who had been uncharacteristically silent during this exchange, now leaned forward. And what of affection, Your Grace? What of companionship? My niece is not some household appliance to be installed in your estate and forgotten. I would not forget her, Edmund said, and for the first time something almost like warmth entered his voice. I have observed Miss Hartwell in circumstances that would have broken lesser individuals. I have read some of the essays she's published under her pseudonym in the literary journals. Yes, Miss Hartwell, I am aware of G.H. Hartley's work and found the analysis of contemporary poetry quite brilliant. I believe we would deal well together. Georgiana's mind reeled. He knew about her writing. She had been so careful to keep it secret, using a pen name precisely because women writers were still viewed with suspicion in many circles. How did you... I make it my business to know about matters that interest me, Edmund said. And I confess, after the incident at the cathedral, I made some inquiries about you. I wanted to understand who I had just publicly allied myself with. And what did you discover? Georgiana asked, torn between indignation at the investigation and curiosity about what he had learned. That you are wasted on the limited role society tried to force you into. That you have a mind that deserves better than flower arranging and supervising tea services. That you deserve a partner who will appreciate your capabilities rather than trying to diminish them. He set down his teacup. I will not pretend this is a romantic offer, Miss Hartwell, but I will promise you respect, autonomy within appropriate bounds, and a life that could be considerably more interesting than the one you almost married into. Georgiana looked at her aunt, who raised her eyebrows expressively but said nothing. This was Georgiana's decision to make. "I need time to consider this," Georgiana said finally. "This is not a choice to be made lightly." "Of course," Edmund rose, as did the ladies. "Take what time you need. I will be in Bath for another week on business. You may send word to my hotel when you have reached a decision." He paused at the door, then turned back. "For what it's worth, Miss Hartwell, I believe you would make an excellent Duchess. The question is whether you believe you would find satisfaction in such a role." After he left, Georgiana sank back onto the settee, her mind whirling. "Well," Agatha said, pouring them both generous measures of brandy, "that was unexpected." "He's offering me an escape," Georgiana said slowly, "a way out of the disaster my life has become. But it would mean binding myself to a stranger, entering a marriage based on practicality rather than affection. As opposed to your marriage to Percival Ashford, which was based on what exactly?" Agatha asked shrewdly. Georgiana couldn't answer that. Her engagement to Percival had been just as practical, just as devoid of genuine feeling. At least Edmund Thornfield was honest about his expectations and motivations. Over the following days, as Georgiana wrestled with the decision, Agatha took it upon herself to reintroduce her niece to Bath society. They attended a lecture at the Bath Literary and Scientific Institution, where Georgiana found herself engaged in stimulating discussion about the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt. They visited the pump room, where the curious stares and whispered conversations followed them, but Agatha's formidable presence and cutting wit discouraged the worst of the gossip. And at a charity concert at the Assembly Rooms, Georgiana encountered Edmund again. He was in conversation with several other gentlemen when she arrived, but he excused himself immediately and approached her with that same calm courtesy. "Miss Hartwell, you're looking well," he said. "Have you been enjoying Bath?" "It's been illuminating," Georgiana replied, acutely aware of the eyes upon them, the speculation their every interaction would generate. "Would you care to walk with me during the interval?" Edmund offered his arm. "I promise to bore you with details about crop rotation and estate management, rather than pressing you for an answer to my proposal." Despite herself, Georgiana smiled. "That does sound remarkably boring." "I excel at it," Edmund assured her, and there was a glint of humor in his eyes that made him seem suddenly less intimidating. They walked through the elegant corridors of the Assembly Rooms, Edmund true to his word, discussing the complexities of managing multiple estates across different counties. But as he spoke, Georgiana found herself paying attention not to the dull details, but to the way he spoke about responsibility to his tenants, his concerns about modernizing agricultural practices while preserving traditional livelihoods, his frustration with peers who viewed their estates as mere sources of income rather than communities to be cared for. "You care deeply about your responsibilities," she observed. "They are the price of privilege," Edmund said simply. "I was born to wealth and position I did nothing to earn. The least I can do is take seriously the welfare of those who depend on that position." It was the most attractive thing anyone had said to Georgiana in months, possibly years. "Your Grace," she said, stopping in a quiet alcove away from prying eyes, "I have reached a decision regarding your proposal." Edmund turned to face her fully, and she could see tension in the set of his shoulders that his calm expression didn't betray. "Yes, I accept," Georgiana said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I will marry you, Edmund Thornfield." Something that might have been relief or perhaps satisfaction flickered across his face. "You honor me, Georgiana. I promise you will not regret this decision." As they returned to the concert hall, Georgiana caught sight of her reflection in one of the tall mirrors lining the corridor. For the first time in days, she didn't see the humiliated bride or the betrayed sister. She saw a woman making her own choice, stepping into an unknown future with her eyes open. It wasn't the romantic fairy tale she might have once dreamed of, but it was hers. The announcement of Georgiana Hartwell's engagement to the Duke of Thornfield sent shockwaves through English society that were felt from London's most exclusive drawing rooms to the farthest country estates. The scandal of her abandoned wedding was suddenly reframed in an entirely new light. Not the humiliating rejection of an unsuitable bride, but the fortunate escape from an inappropriate match before she married a duke. Society's narrative machine whirred and clicked, and within days, Percival Ashford was cast as the villain who had nearly trapped a future duchess, and Charlotte Hartwell as the scheming sister whose machinations had been thwarted by true love and nobility. The fact that none of this was remotely true didn't matter in the slightest. Edmund had insisted on a proper courtship period before the wedding, much to Lady Margaret's barely concealed frustration. She wanted the marriage completed immediately, before anything could go wrong, but Edmund was immovable. "Society must believe this is genuine," he told Georgiana during one of his daily visits to Lady Agatha's townhouse. "A rushed marriage would invite the very speculation we're trying to avoid." So began 6 weeks of carefully orchestrated public appearances designed to establish their relationship as not only legitimate, but desirable. Edmund was an attentive suitor in the most appropriate ways, calling upon Georgiana at proper hours, escorting her and Lady Agatha to concerts and lectures, sending thoughtful gifts that showed he paid attention to her interests. He gave her a beautiful leather-bound first edition of Wordsworth's poetry, a set of watercolors from Italy when he learned she enjoyed painting, and a stunning pearl necklace that had belonged to his mother. Georgiana found herself surprised by how comfortable Edmund's company became. Their conversations ranged far beyond the weather and social pleasantries that had characterized her interactions with Percival. Edmund had travelled extensively in his youth, and his stories of Vienna, Rome, and Athens were fascinating. He discussed politics with her, actually listened to her opinions on social reforms and women's education, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than merely tolerating them. "You know," Agatha said one evening after Edmund had departed following dinner, "I believe the man actually likes you." "We have a cordial understanding," Georgiana replied, but she felt warmth in her cheeks. "Cordial understanding," Agatha snorted. "I've seen the way he looks at you when you're absorbed in conversation. That's not duty, my dear. That's interest." Georgiana didn't allow herself to dwell on this possibility. She had accepted Edmund's practical proposal on practical terms, and to start hoping for something more would be dangerous to her peace of mind. Better to appreciate the respect and intellectual companionship he offered than to yearn for romantic sentiments he had never promised. The true test came 6 weeks after their engagement, when Edmund invited Georgiana, Agatha, and the Hartwell family to Thornfield Abbey for a weekend party. It was to be a grand affair, introducing Georgiana to Edmund's family and closest friends, and effectively launching her new position in society. It would also be the first time Georgiana would face her family, all of them, including Charlotte, since the cathedral disaster. Thornfield Abbey was breathtaking. Set in the lush countryside of Dorset, the estate sprawled across thousands of acres of parkland, with the abbey itself a magnificent structure of Elizabethan architecture, all golden stone and glittering windows. As their carriage rolled up the sweeping drive, Georgiana felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation or anxiety. "It's rather magnificent," Agatha said, peering out the window. "You're going to be mistress of all this?" "I'm going to try not to think about that just yet," Georgiana murmured. Edmund met them at the entrance, resplendent in country gentleman attire, his informal dress somehow making him seem more approachable than his usual formal perfection. "Welcome to Thornfield," he said, handing Georgiana down from the carriage with careful courtesy. "I hope you'll come to think of it as home." The interior of the abbey was even more impressive than the exterior. Soaring ceilings, priceless artwork, furnishings that spanned centuries of impeccable taste. But Edmund led them past the public rooms to a more intimate drawing room where a silver-haired woman sat reading by the window. "Georgiana, may I present my aunt, Lady Beatrice Thornfield," Edmund said. "Aunt Beatrice, Miss Georgiana Hartwell." Lady Beatrice set down her book and examined Georgiana with sharp blue eyes that reminded her of Agatha's assessing gaze. After a long moment she smiled. "You'll do," she announced. "I was worried Edmund would choose some simpering debutante more concerned with her gowns than her responsibilities. But Agatha has told me all about you, and I approve." Georgiana shot a glance at her aunt, who looked entirely too pleased with herself. Apparently, Agatha and Lady Beatrice had been corresponding behind the scenes. The house party that evening brought together an interesting mixture of guests. Edmund's younger brother, Captain James Thornfield, was on leave from his regiment and proved to be charming and rakishly handsome, with an easy humour that contrasted with Edmund's more reserved demeanour. Several of Edmund's closest friends from university attended, along with neighbouring families of importance. And inevitably, the Hartwells arrived. Sir Edward looking uncomfortable in such elevated company, Lady Margaret practically vibrating with pride at her daughter's spectacular match, and Charlotte, pale and subdued, escorted by Percival Ashford. Georgiana steeled herself when they were announced, but Edmund was beside her immediately, his hand coming to rest lightly at the small of her back in a gesture of support. "Sir Edward, Lady Margaret, welcome," Edmund said with perfect courtesy. Then, with considerably less warmth, "Ashford, Miss Charlotte." Charlotte couldn't meet Georgiana's eyes, but Percival had apparently decided to brazen it out. "Your Grace, Miss Hartwell, congratulations on your betrothal. Most unexpected." "Not to those who were paying attention," Edmund replied smoothly. "But then, attention to detail was never your strong suit, was it, Ashford?" The barb landed, and Percival's face flushed. Before he could respond, Lady Beatrice swept in, all grandmotherly warmth directed at the Hartwells and arctic chill toward Percival and Charlotte. "Do come in. We're about to go in to dinner. Lady Margaret, you must sit beside me and tell me all about Georgiana's childhood. I want to know everything about my future niece." Dinner was an elaborate affair, with courses that seemed endless and conversation that flowed around the long table. Georgiana found herself seated between Edmund and his friend, Lord Westbrook, a witty gentleman with interests in scientific advancement, who immediately engaged her in discussion about the new railway systems being built across England. "Edmund mentioned you had published some essays on literature," Westbrook said, his eyes twinkling. "Quite controversial stuff, from what I understand. Are you planning to continue writing after your marriage?" Georgiana glanced at Edmund, uncertain. They hadn't discussed this. "I certainly hope so," Edmund said before she could respond. "Georgiana's insights are far too valuable to waste on domestic trivialities. I've already had my secretary set up a study for her at the Abbey, properly appointed for serious work." Georgiana felt something warm bloom in her chest. He had prepared a study for her? Without even asking, simply assuming she would want to continue her intellectual pursuits. "How remarkably progressive of you, Thornfield," another guest said, though the tone suggested he didn't quite approve. "I prefer to think of it as practical," Edmund replied. "Georgiana has a brilliant mind. Only a fool would fail to appreciate and encourage that." Conversation around the table had quieted, as it inevitably did when people sensed drama brewing. Further down the table, Charlotte was staring at her plate, her face flushed, while Percival looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Some might say a woman's brilliance is better applied to managing her household and raising her children," Percival said, his voice carrying an edge. "That intellectual pursuits are better left to men." "Some might say that," Edmund agreed, his voice dangerously pleasant. "Those same people probably think it's acceptable to publicly humiliate a woman at the altar, so I tend to discount their opinions on most matters." The silence that followed was absolute. Percival looked as if he'd been slapped, and several guests were visibly trying not to smile. "I think," Lady Beatrice announced into the silence, "that this is an excellent time for the ladies to withdraw and leave you gentlemen to your port." The ladies filed out to the drawing-room, and Georgiana found herself immediately surrounded by several women eager to speak with the future Duchess of Thornfield. But Charlotte approached hesitantly, and the other women melted away with the instinct of those who sense a private conversation brewing. "Georgiana," Charlotte began, her voice trembling slightly. I wanted to apologize. Properly, I mean. What I did was unforgivable." Georgiana looked at her sister, really looked at her for the first time since the cathedral. Charlotte had lost weight, and there were shadows under her eyes. Whatever happiness she had expected from her choice, it hadn't materialized. "Are you happy, Charlotte?" Georgiana asked quietly. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "Percival's father has disowned him. We have no income, no prospects. His friends have cut him off, and society whispers whenever we appear. He blames me for it all, says I tempted him into destroying his life. The love he proclaimed from the altar has faded rather dramatically in the face of consequence." Georgiana felt no satisfaction in hearing this, only a weary sadness. "You made your choice, Charlotte." "I know," Charlotte whispered. "I thought I was following my heart, but I see now that I was following vanity and excitement. Percival pursued me because I was forbidden, because it was thrilling to conduct a secret flirtation with his fiancée's sister. Once the thrill was gone, and only the wreckage remained." She shook her head. "I've lost you, I've lost my reputation, and I've gained nothing worth having. I'm so profoundly sorry." Georgiana wanted to rage at her, to make Charlotte feel even a fraction of the humiliation she had experienced. But looking at her sister's genuine anguish, she found she couldn't sustain the fury. Charlotte had been foolish and selfish, but she was paying a heavy price. "I forgive you," Georgiana said finally, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I don't forget, Charlotte, and I don't trust you. But I forgive you because holding on to this anger serves no purpose." Charlotte's tears spilled over. "Thank you," she breathed. "That's more than I deserve." "Yes," Georgiana agreed. "It is. Don't waste the mercy, Charlotte. Learn from it." When the gentleman rejoined them, Edmund came directly to Georgiana's side, his eyes questioning. She gave him a small nod, and something in his expression relaxed. The rest of the evening passed with music and cards, but the earlier tension had dissipated. As the party broke up and guests retired to their rooms, Edmund walked Georgiana to the grand staircase that led to the family wing. "You handled that with remarkable grace," he said softly. "Your sister's contrition, Ashford's obvious misery. You could have been vindictive, and no one would have blamed you." "What purpose would that serve?" Georgiana asked. "They're already punished by their own choices. I need to move forward, not remain trapped in the past." Edmund stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned to face her fully. In the soft candlelight, his features seemed less austere, his eyes warmer than she'd yet seen them. "I find myself continually impressed by you, Georgiana Hartwell. When I made my proposal, I thought I understood what I was getting, an intelligent, capable woman who could manage the responsibilities of being a duchess. But you're so much more than that." Georgiana's heart was beating faster than it should. "More, stronger, wiser, more forgiving than I could be in your position." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "I am beginning to think that a marriage of convenience may have been selling us both short." Before Georgiana could respond to that extraordinary statement, Lady Beatrice's voice called from the upstairs landing. "Edmund, stop monopolizing your fiancée. The poor girl needs her rest before tomorrow's festivities." Edmund smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. "Good night, Georgiana. Sleep well." "Good night," she managed, and fled up the stairs before he could see the blush burning in her cheeks. In her room, a magnificent chamber that she was informed would be the Duchess's suite once they married, Georgiana sat before the mirror while Agatha's maid helped her undress. She touched the pearl necklace Edmund had given her, which she had worn tonight. A marriage of convenience may have been selling us both short. What did that mean? Was Edmund suggesting he felt something beyond practical regard? And if he was, how did she feel about that? Georgiana looked at her reflection and saw a woman quite different from the one who had stood at the altar 6 weeks ago. That woman had been resigned to duty, prepared to sacrifice herself for family obligation. This woman was choosing her own path, making her own decisions, and beginning to believe she might deserve something more than mere convenience. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The announcement of Georgiana and Edmund's wedding date, 6 weeks hence, sparked another frenzy of social activity. Invitations were sent to every important family in England, and the preparations at Thornfield Abbey took on the character of a military campaign. Lady Beatrice oversaw everything with the precision of a general, while Lady Margaret attempted to insert herself into every decision until Edmund gently but firmly established that this wedding would be conducted according to his and Georgiana's wishes, not her mother's social ambitions. Georgiana found herself caught in a whirlwind of fittings for her trousseau, meetings with the Abbey's housekeeper to understand the running of the vast household, and discussions with Edmund about their future. The more time she spent with him, the more she came to appreciate not just his intelligence and integrity, but the subtle humor that emerged when he was comfortable, the kindness he showed to servants and tenants, the way his entire face changed when he smiled genuinely. And the way he looked at her was changing. The respectful regard had deepened into something warmer, something that made her pulse quicken when he entered a room. 3 weeks before the wedding, Percival Ashford appeared at Thornfield Abbey, unannounced. Georgiana was in the morning room reviewing menu plans with the cook when the butler appeared, his expression disapproving. "Mr. Percival Ashford requests an audience with you, Miss Hartwell. I have shown him to the small receiving room." Georgiana's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won out. What could Percival possibly want to say to her now? She dismissed the cook and made her way to the receiving room, where Percival stood by the window, his back to the door. He had changed in the weeks since she had last seen him. His clothes, while still well-tailored, showed signs of wear, and he had lost the confident bearing that had once characterized him. When he turned at her entrance, she saw genuine anguish in his face. "Miss Hartwell, or should I say your grace to be," he began, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me. What do you want, Percival?" Georgiana remained standing by the door, making no move to sit or invite him to do so. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Properly, without society watching, without pride in the way. What I did to you at the cathedral was unconscionable. I convinced myself I was following my heart, but in truth I was following an infatuation while neglecting honor, duty, and basic decency. You destroyed my reputation and humiliated me in front of everyone I've ever known," Georgiana said flatly. "Why should I care about your regrets now?" "You shouldn't," Percival admitted, "but I needed to tell you that you did nothing to deserve that treatment. The fault was entirely mine. You would have been a wonderful wife, and I was too shallow to see it." Georgiana studied him for a long moment. "Are you happy, Percival? With Charlotte?" His laugh was bitter. "Happy? I'm cut off from my family, ostracized by society, living on a clerk's salary because it's the only employment I could find. Charlotte and I argue constantly. She blames me for the loss of her family's regard. I blame her for tempting me into this disaster, and we are both miserable. Whatever I thought I felt for her has curdled into resentment." "Then you have precisely what you deserve," Georgiana said without heat. "You made your choice based on momentary passion rather than considered judgment. The consequence is exactly what you should have expected." "I know," Percival said miserably, "but watching you with Thornfield, seeing how he looks at you, how you've blossomed into confidence and happiness, it's made me realize what I threw away. Not your fortune or connections, but you, your intelligence, your grace, your kindness." "Stop," Georgiana said sharply. "Whatever remorse you feel now, it comes too late and means too little. I have moved on, Percival. I am engaged to a man who values me, who respects my mind, who encourages my ambitions rather than trying to diminish them. I'm going to be happy, truly happy, in ways I never would have been with you." "I know," Percival said again, and his shoulders sagged with defeat. I only came to say that I am sorry and that I hope you can forgive me someday, not for my sake, but for yours, so you need not carry the burden of justified hatred." Before Georgiana could respond, the door opened and Edmund entered, his expression thunderous. "I was informed we had an unwelcome visitor," he said, his voice cold enough to frost glass. "Your Grace," Percival said, his face flushing, "I was just leaving. I came only to apologize to Miss Hartwell for my unconscionable behavior." "Your apology is noted and utterly insufficient," Edmund said, moving to stand beside Georgiana in a clear gesture of protection and possession. "You will leave my property immediately, and you will not attempt to contact my fiancée again. Am I understood?" "Yes, Your Grace," Percival said, and he looked so utterly defeated that Georgiana almost felt pity for him. Almost. "Percival," she said as he moved toward the door. He turned back, hope flickering in his eyes. "I do forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger would poison my happiness. But forgiveness does not mean I forget, and it does not mean you are welcome in my life. Goodbye." Percival nodded once and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Edmund turned to Georgiana immediately, his hands coming up to gently grip her shoulders. "Are you all right? Did he upset you? I should have refused him entry entirely, but my butler said you agreed to see him, and I didn't want to override your decision." "I'm fine," Georgiana assured him, surprised and warmed by his protective concern. He came to apologize and to wallow in his own misery. He and Charlotte are wretchedly unhappy together. "Good," Edmund said with satisfaction. "I'm not normally a vindictive man, but in their case I make an exception." Georgiana laughed, feeling the tension drain away. "You're rather fierce when protecting those you care about." "Those I care about," Edmund repeated slowly, and something shifted in his expression. His hands slid from her shoulders to gently cup her face, and her breath caught. "Georgiana, I need to tell you something, and it cannot wait any longer." "Yes," she whispered, her heart hammering. "When I proposed this arrangement, I told you I wanted a practical partnership, a marriage of mutual benefit without romantic expectations. I believed that was what I wanted, what I needed. I had convinced myself that affection would only complicate matters, that respect and compatibility were sufficient foundations for a good marriage. Edmund, but I was wrong," he continued, his thumbs brushing gently across her cheekbones. "Somewhere in these past weeks, something changed. Watching you navigate society's whispers with such dignity, seeing your brilliant mind engage with topics that fascinate me as well, witnessing your capacity for forgiveness even when you had every right to be bitter, Georgiana, I find myself falling in love with you." The world seemed to stop. Georgiana stared up at him, certain she had misheard. You love me." "I love you," Edmund confirmed, and his smile was tender and a little uncertain. "I know this wasn't part of our agreement. I know you accepted my proposal for practical reasons, and I don't expect you to suddenly return the sentiment just because I've been foolish enough to develop genuine feelings. But I couldn't marry you without being honest about where my heart stands." Georgiana's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of wonder rather than sadness. "Edmund, you impossible man. How could you think I wouldn't return the feeling? I've been fighting against caring for you precisely because I thought you wanted only a practical arrangement. I didn't want to embarrass myself by developing a romantic attachment you didn't desire." Edmund's expression transformed from uncertainty to blazing joy. "You care for me. I care for you," Georgiana confirmed, laughing through her tears. "I think I started falling in love with you when you first proposed that study for my writing, without even asking if I wanted it, simply assuming my work was valuable enough to require proper space. What woman wouldn't love a man who sees her mind as worth cultivating rather than suppressing? Then we have been dancing around each other like fools," Edmund said, and then he was kissing her. A kiss that held all the restrained emotion of their weeks together, all the feelings they had carefully not expressed. Georgiana melted into him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, and for a long moment there was nothing but the two of them and the perfect rightness of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Edmund rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Georgiana. Not because it's practical or socially advantageous, but because I love you and want to spend my life making you happy." "I already agreed to marry you," Georgiana pointed out, smiling. "That was different. That was strategy and convenience. I'm asking again, properly, as a man who loves you and hopes desperately that you might love him in return." "Yes," Georgiana said, her voice full of certainty and joy. "Yes, Edmund Thornfield, I will marry you, for love, for partnership, for the future we'll build together." The remaining weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of happiness and preparation. The change in their relationship was evident to everyone. Edmund was more relaxed, more openly affectionate, and Georgiana glowed with a contentment that no amount of preparation stress could diminish. Lady Beatrice pulled her aside one afternoon, a knowing smile on her face. "I'm very pleased to see you and Edmund have discovered what I suspected would develop. You're good for him, you know. He's been too serious, too focused on duty. You've reminded him that joy and love have their place too." The day before the wedding, Georgiana's family arrived at Thornfield for the festivities. Her father was still uncomfortable, but clearly relieved that his daughter's future was secure. Her mother was in her element, finally able to take credit for her daughter's spectacular match. And Charlotte, still subdued, but genuinely trying to make amends, helped Georgiana with her final preparations, with the tentative beginnings of sisterly affection rebuilding between them. "You look happy," Charlotte said softly, as she helped arrange Georgiana's veil. "Truly happy, not just resigned." "I am," Georgiana confirmed. "I never expected this, Charlotte. I thought I was agreeing to a practical arrangement, but I found love instead. Real love, based on respect and genuine partnership." "I'm glad," Charlotte said, and Georgiana could hear the sincerity in her voice. "You deserve every happiness, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the forgiveness you've shown me." That night, unable to sleep with excitement and nerves, Georgiana slipped down to the library, where she found Edmund already there, staring out at the moonlit gardens. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Anticipation," Edmund admitted, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. "Tomorrow you become my Duchess, my wife, my partner in everything." "Are you nervous?" Georgiana asked. "Terrified," Edmund admitted with a small laugh. "Not about marrying you, that's the only thing I'm certain of, but about being worthy of you, about making you as happy as you deserve to be." Georgiana turned to face him fully, placing her hand over his heart. "Edmund, you've already made me happier than I ever imagined being. You see me, truly see me, as I am, not as society says I should be. You value my mind, encourage my ambitions, and love me not despite my complexities, but because of them. That's all I'll ever need." Edmund pulled her close, and they stood together in the moonlight, two people who had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances, and discovered that sometimes the most practical of arrangements could lead to the most profound of loves. "Tomorrow," Edmund murmured against her hair, "begins the rest of our life together." "Then I can't wait," Georgiana replied, and she meant it with her entire heart. 8 months after the wedding that had united Georgiana Hartwell and Edmund Thornfield, the Duchess of Thornfield stood in her study at Thornfield Abbey, reviewing the final proofs of her latest essay for the Edinburgh Review. Outside the window, spring had transformed the estate into a riot of green and gold, with daffodils carpeting the lawns and new leaves unfurling on ancient trees. The study Edmund had promised her was everything she could have hoped for. A spacious room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive oak desk positioned to catch the best light, and comfortable chairs for reading and reflection. The past months had exceeded Georgiana's most optimistic expectations. Marriage to Edmund had proven to be a partnership in the truest sense. They managed the estate together, discussed political and social issues with genuine intellectual exchange, and had discovered a physical passion that had surprised them both with its intensity. Edmund encouraged her writing, often serving as her first reader and offering thoughtful critique. In turn, Georgiana had embraced her responsibilities as Duchess with enthusiasm, implementing reforms to improve tenant housing, establishing a school for the estate workers' children, and hosting salons where progressive thinkers could gather and debate. "Still working?" Edmund asked, entering the study with his characteristic grace. He had just returned from riding the property with his steward, and his hair was wind-blown, his cheeks coloured from the exercise. Georgiana thought he had never looked more handsome. "Just finishing the final review," Georgiana said, setting down her pen and rising to greet him properly. He met her halfway across the room, pulling her into his arms for a kiss that still made her pulse race even after months of marriage. "What's this one about?" Edmund asked, glancing at the pages on her desk. "Women's access to higher education," Georgiana replied. "The argument is that excluding half the population from advanced learning is not only morally indefensible, but practically foolish. We're wasting tremendous intellectual potential." "It will cause quite a stir," Edmund predicted, but his tone was approving rather than concerned. "The conservative establishment will be scandalized." "Good," Georgiana said with satisfaction. "Someone needs to challenge their outdated assumptions." "That's my revolutionary Duchess," Edmund said fondly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of challenging assumptions, I received a letter from the Secretary of the Board of Agriculture today. They want me to present our estate modernization program at the next parliamentary session as a model for other landowners." "Edmund, that's wonderful!" Georgiana exclaimed. They had spent months developing sustainable improvements to agricultural practices, and seeing that work recognized was immensely gratifying. "It's our program," Edmund corrected. "Your suggestions for crop rotation and soil improvement were crucial. You should present it with me." "A woman addressing Parliament?" Georgiana raised an eyebrow. "That would be scandalous indeed." "Then let's be scandalous together," Edmund said, his eyes twinkling. "Besides, half the members' wives already attend sessions from the gallery. We're simply arguing that if women are going to be there anyway, they might as well have a voice." Georgiana laughed, loving how Edmund challenged conventions without even seeming to realize how radical he was being. This was the life she had dreamed of, but never believed possible. Intellectual partnership, genuine affection, and the freedom to pursue her passions while fulfilling her responsibilities. A knock at the study door interrupted them, and Lady Beatrice entered, looking pleased with herself. "I thought you'd both want to know. The school opens next week, and we've received applications from 23 children. The response has been tremendous." The school for tenant children had been Georgiana's project, but Lady Beatrice had thrown herself into it with enthusiasm. Together, they had converted an unused building on the estate into a bright, welcoming classroom, and hired a progressive young teacher from London who believed all children, regardless of class, deserved quality education. "That's more than we hoped for," Georgiana said, delighted. "Does Mrs. Patterson feel ready?" "She's thrilled," Lady Beatrice assured her. "And several mothers have asked if there might be evening classes for adults who want to learn to read and write. I told them we'd consider it." "Absolutely," Edmund said immediately. "An educated workforce is more productive and happier. It benefits everyone." Over dinner that evening, the conversation turned to London, where the social season was in full swing. Edmund and Georgiana had spent a month in London earlier in the spring, fulfilling their social obligations and introducing the new Duchess of Thornfield to society. The reception had been remarkably warm. Georgiana's intelligence and Edmund's powerful position made them one of the most sought-after couples, their invitations prized and their salons well attended. "I received a letter from Duchess Devonshire," Georgiana mentioned. "She's organizing a charity benefit for foundling hospitals and wants me to serve on the planning committee. It means spending another few weeks in London next month." "We can manage that," Edmund said. I need to be in London for parliamentary sessions anyway. We'll make an occasion of it. Your mother also wrote, Georgiana added, her tone more cautious. Lady Margaret had been notably absent from Thornfield since the wedding, choosing to spend her time in Bath with Lady Agatha. And, Edmund prompted, noting his wife's hesitation, she wants to visit, but she's asking permission to bring Charlotte. Georgiana set down her fork, watching Edmund's face carefully. They had not seen Charlotte or Percival since the wedding, though Georgiana had maintained minimal correspondence with her sister. The news from that quarter was consistently grim. Percival was drinking heavily, unable to maintain steady employment, and their marriage had deteriorated into mutual recrimination. It's your decision, Edmund said carefully. This is your home, and I will support whatever you choose. Georgiana considered. The anger she had felt towards Charlotte had faded over the months, replaced by something closer to pity. Her sister had made terrible choices and was living with the consequences. Perhaps it was time to extend something more than mere forgiveness. Perhaps it was time for genuine reconciliation. Tell Mother they're both welcome, Georgiana said finally. But make it clear this is a brief visit, and there will be conditions. Charlotte needs to understand that while I've forgiven her, trust must be rebuilt slowly. You have a generous heart, Edmund observed, covering her hand with his. I have a full heart, Georgiana corrected. I'm happy, Edmund, truly, deeply happy, and that happiness makes it easier to show compassion to those who aren't as fortunate. The visit, when it occurred 2 weeks later, was stilted at first. Charlotte was thinner than Georgiana remembered, with a brittleness to her beauty that spoke of unhappiness and stress. Lady Margaret hovered anxiously, clearly terrified that Charlotte would say or do something to damage the fragile reconciliation. But to Georgiana's surprise, Charlotte seemed genuinely changed by her experiences. She admired the estate's improvements, asked intelligent questions about the school project, and showed real interest in Georgiana's writing. On the 3rd day of the visit, as they walked together through the Abbey's famous rose gardens, Charlotte finally broached the subject they had been dancing around. I'm leaving Percival, she said quietly. I've secured a position as a companion to an elderly lady in Edinburgh. It doesn't pay much, but it will give me independence and distance from everything. Georgiana stopped walking, turning to face her sister. You're leaving your marriage. What marriage? Charlotte said bitterly. We can barely stand to be in the same room. He blames me for the loss of his family and fortune. I blame him for pursuing me with promises he couldn't keep. There's no affection left, only resentment. The best thing we can do for each other is part ways. Mother will be scandalized, Georgiana said. Mother is already scandalized by my existence, Charlotte pointed out. At least this way, I can build some kind of life for myself, rather than slowly poisoning both Percival and myself with our mutual unhappiness. Georgiana studied her sister, seeing a maturity and self-awareness that hadn't been there before. What do you need from me? Nothing, Charlotte said firmly. I'm not asking for money or influence or help securing the position. I've done that myself. I only wanted you to know and to tell you that I understand now what I destroyed when I chose Percival. You had real love, a real partnership waiting for you, and I nearly ruined it with my selfishness. I'm sorry, not just for the humiliation, but for almost costing you the happiness you deserve. I forgive you, Charlotte, Georgiana said, and this time she meant it without reservation. And I hope you find happiness too, eventually. You made terrible mistakes, but you don't have to be defined by them forever. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered. That's more than I deserve. They walked back to the Abbey together, and over the remaining days of the visit, Georgiana saw glimpses of the sister she had loved before betrayal had torn them apart. It would take time to rebuild trust, if such a thing was even possible, but at least there was a foundation now. Honest acknowledgement of wrongs, genuine contrition, and a tentative path forward. After Charlotte and Lady Margaret departed, Edmund found Georgiana in the library, curled up in her favourite chair with a book she wasn't really reading. How are you feeling? he asked, sitting on the arm of the chair and running his fingers gently through her hair. Reflective, Georgiana admitted. A year ago, I was about to marry a man I didn't love, resign myself to a life of shallow domesticity, and sacrifice my own aspirations for family duty. Now I'm married to you, pursuing work that matters to me, making real changes in our community, and actually happy. How did I get so fortunate? I ask myself the same question every day, Edmund said softly. When I walked into that cathedral and saw you standing at the altar, so dignified in the face of betrayal, I had no idea I was witnessing the moment my entire life would change. Helping you was supposed to be a simple act of chivalry. I never expected to find the love of my life. Georgiana set aside her book and pulled Edmund down into the chair with her, settling into his embrace with the comfort of long familiarity. Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the drama, tying yourself to someone with such a notorious history? Never, Edmund said firmly. Not once. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Georgiana. You've made me better, happier, more purposeful. Whatever scandal came with loving you was a small price to pay. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon sun paint golden patterns across the library floor. This was happiness, Georgiana thought. Not the grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the quiet certainty of being with someone who truly saw you, valued you, and chose you every day. The sound of horses in the drive broke their peaceful moment, and moments later, the butler appeared to announce unexpected visitors. Captain James Thornfield had arrived with news. He was being promoted and transferred to India, and he wanted to celebrate with his brother before departing. The evening that followed was filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of easy companionship that only close family could create. As Georgiana watched Edmund joke with his brother, saw Lady Beatrice's fond exasperation at their antics, and felt the warmth of being truly part of this family, she marvelled again at the strange path that had led her here. She thought of Percival Ashford, drinking away his regrets in some shabby London lodging. She thought of Charlotte preparing to start over in Edinburgh with nothing but her courage and hard-won wisdom. She thought of all the things that could have gone differently if Edmund hadn't been in that cathedral, if he hadn't chosen to intervene, if she hadn't been brave enough to accept his extraordinary proposal. But those things had happened in exactly the sequence they needed to, and the result was this: a life of purpose, partnership, and profound love. A life where she could be fully herself, intellectual, ambitious, passionate, and be cherished rather than diminished for it. A life where she had bloomed, not in spite of her transplanting, but because of it, finding richer soil and more nurturing conditions than she had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" Edmund asked later that night as they prepared for bed, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they stood at the window of their chamber, looking out at the moonlit estate. "About how grateful I am," Georgiana said simply, "for you, for this life, for every twist of fate that brought us together. I was so afraid that day at the cathedral, so certain my life was over, but it was only beginning." "Our life was only beginning," Edmund corrected, turning her to face him. "And every day I wake up beside you, I know I'm the most fortunate man in England." He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise, and Georgiana thought that this love, this partnership, this beautiful life they were building together was worth every moment of pain and humiliation that had preceded it. She had been abandoned at the altar by a weak man who didn't deserve her, only to be claimed by a strong one who did. She had been publicly humiliated, only to rise from those ashes more confident and capable than before. And most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually gifts in disguise, forcing us away from paths we were never meant to walk and toward the destinies we were always meant to claim. As Edmund carried her to their bed, both of them laughing like the young, happy newlyweds they still were, Georgiana sent a silent thank you to whatever force of fate had intervened that day in the cathedral. She had gone to St. Augustine's expecting to resign herself to duty and settle for contentment. Instead, she had found love, purpose, and a happiness so profound it still took her breath away. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would spend the rest of her life blooming in this soil, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing day, cherished by a man who saw her true worth and loved her not in spite of who she was, but because of it. That was the greatest triumph of all. If you've been with us through this entire journey, from heartbreak to happiness, from abandonment to triumph, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories about love, betrayal, and redemption. Hit the like button if Georgiana and Edmund's story moved you, and tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment where what seemed like the worst thing that could happen turned out to be a blessing in disguise? Share your stories, and remember, sometimes we bloom most beautifully when we're transplanted from where we thought we belonged to where we truly belong.